The bustling streets of Los Angeles buzz with life as the golden glow of the late afternoon sun kissed the tops of skyscrapers. People hurried along the sidewalks, heads down, lost in their own worlds. Amid the usual chaos, a black SUV cruised down the boulevard, its windows tinted, giving no hint of its distinguished passenger. Inside the vehicle sat Special Agent Miguel Ramirez, a seasoned Filipino-American FBI operative with a reputation for brilliance. Dressed sharply in a tailored navy blue suit, Miguel exuded confidence. His presence was commanding yet approachable. A man who had navigated through the ranks of a demanding career while holding on to his humble roots. His badge and gun rested in their usual spots, concealed but always ready. Miguel was on his way to a classified meeting, a routine yet critical part of his job. As the SUV rolled to a stop at a red light, Miguel's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and smiled faintly. It was a text from his younger sister, who never missed a chance to remind him to eat properly or ask when he'd visit the family again. Miguel replied quickly, his fingers flying over the screen, promising he'd call her later. The light turned green, and the SUV resumed its journey. But just as they approached a busy intersection, the piercing wail of police sirens shattered the air. Miguel's driver, a younger agent named Carl, tensed up, but kept his hands firmly on the wheel. In the rearview mirror, flashing red and blue lights signaled that they were the target of the commotion. "What's going on?" Miguel asked, his voice calm but firm. "Not sure," Carl replied, pulling over to the side of the road. "Maybe a routine check." 2 police cruisers boxed them in, and 4 uniformed officers approached, hands hovering near their holsters. The air grew tense, and Miguel could feel the weight of the moment settling over him. He rolled down his window, his FBI badge discreetly tucked inside his jacket pocket. One of the officers, a burly man with a closely shaved head, stepped forward. His badge read, Officer Grayson. Without so much as a greeting, he barked, "Driver, step out of the vehicle." "Now." Carl glanced back at Miguel, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. Miguel gave him a slight nod. "Two, as they say." Carl complied, stepping out slowly with his hands visible. Another officer moved in to frisk him, while Officer Brayson peered into the SUV. His eyes locked onto Miguel, his expression hardening. "You too," Brayson ordered, gesturing for Miguel to exit. Miguel raised an eyebrow, his instincts kicking in. Something about the situation felt off. Still, he reached for the door handle, stepping out with deliberate calmness. "May I ask what this is about, officer?" he inquired, his tone even, but laced with authority. Grayson ignored the question, sizing up Miguel. "Turn around. Hands on the vehicle." Miguel hesitated. "I'm an FBI agent. I have identification in my—" "Hands on the vehicle," Grayson interrupted, his voice rising. The streets seemed to pause as onlookers began gathering, their phones aimed at the unfolding scene. Miguel could feel the weight of their stares, the whispers cutting through the tense silence. He complied, pressing his palms against the cool surface of the SUV, his jaw tightening. As another officer patted him down, Miguel calmly repeated, "My badge is in my jacket. If you just check—" "Shut it," Grayson snapped. "We'll see about that." Miguel bit back a retort, his mind racing. Was this a case of mistaken identity? Or something worse? He glanced over at Carl, who was now handcuffed and seated on the curb, looking bewildered. A crowd was forming now, murmurs growing louder. "What's going on?" Someone asked. "Why are they arresting him?" Grayson pulled out his radio, muttering something unintelligible, then turned back to Miguel. "You match the description of someone we're looking for. Drug dealer. Dangerous. Filipino." Miguel's pulse quickened, though his face remained composed. "Officer, you're making a mistake. I can prove who I am." "Save it," Grayson cut him off. He gestured to his team. "Cuff him." Before Miguel could respond, cold steel encircled his wrists, and he was shoved roughly into the back of a squad car. The crowd gasped, a few voices rising in protest. "He didn't do anything," one man shouted. Inside the police car, Miguel's heart pounded, not from fear, but from anger. This wasn't just about him. It was about the prejudice that had reared its ugly head in plain sight. He had spent years serving his country, risking his life to uphold the law, and now he was being treated like a common criminal. As the car pulled away, Miguel glanced out the window, locking eyes with the young boy in the crowd. The boy's expression was one of confusion and fear. Miguel knew that look all too well. It was the look of someone who had just seen justice falter. In the front seat, Grayson muttered something to his partner, a younger officer who seemed uneasy. What if he's telling the truth? The partner asked hesitantly. Grayson scoffed. Guys like him always have a story. Don't let it fool you. Miguel sat back, his mind calculating his next move. He knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for now he would have to play their game and wait for the right moment to turn the tables. The squad car sped through the city, sirens blaring, as Miguel stared straight ahead, a storm brewing behind his calm exterior. Somewhere in the distance, the city carried on, oblivious to the injustice unfolding in its midst. The squad car sped through the streets, weaving in and out of traffic as the wail of the siren echoed off the surrounding buildings. Miguel sat in the back seat, his hands cuffed behind him, his expression unreadable. The anger simmering beneath his calm exterior wasn't just personal. It was the deep frustration of someone who had seen this kind of injustice play out too many times, both as an observer and now, unexpectedly, as a victim. He replayed the officer's words in his mind. You match the description. It was an excuse he'd heard countless times in stories from other minorities who had faced similar humiliations. The description was always conveniently vague, just enough to justify a baseless stop. He thought of the young boy in the crowd, the fear and confusion in his eyes. That image struck a nerve. What message had this moment sent to him? To everyone watching? Miguel's thoughts were interrupted as the squad car slowed and pulled into the parking lot of a precinct on the city's outskirts. The building was older, its brick facade faded and worn. Grayson yanked the car door open and gestured for Miguel to step out. Let's go, he barked. Miguel stepped out carefully, feeling the sharp bite of the cuffs against his wrists. As Grayson roughly guided him toward the entrance, Miguel glanced around, taking in his surroundings. Every detail mattered. He wasn't just a man under arrest. He was an investigator, always gathering evidence, always observing. Inside, the station was a chaotic mix of ringing phones, muffled conversations, and the occasional burst of laughter from officers at their desks. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over everything, amplifying the tension in the air. Miguel was led through the bullpen, past rows of desks cluttered with paperwork, coffee mugs, and half-eaten lunches. He caught the curious glances of a few officers, their eyes briefly meeting his before quickly looking away. Grayson stopped in front of a desk and shoved Miguel into a chair. Stay put, he ordered, before walking off to confer with another officer. Miguel shifted slightly in his seat, testing the cuffs. They were tight, but he forced himself to remain composed. Losing his temper now would only make things worse. As he sat there, Miguel's mind drifted back to his early days in the FBI. He had joined with the hope of making a difference, of standing up for people who couldn't fight for themselves. He had grown up in a working-class Filipino-American family where hard work and resilience were deeply ingrained values. His parents had taught him to stand tall in the face of adversity, a lesson he carried with him to this day. Those lessons had served him well in his career, but now, sitting here in cuffs, he felt the sting of their limitations. Even the badge he had earned through years of dedication couldn't shield him from the biases that still ran deep. Grayson returned, holding a folder. He slapped it down on the desk and flipped it open. Miguel Ramirez, he said, his tone dripping with skepticism. That's quite a name for someone we just picked up near a known drug corridor. Miguel met his gaze steadily. It's also the name of an FBI agent. My credentials are in my jacket pocket. If you take a moment, to... I'll get to that, Grayson interrupted, smirking. But first, let's talk about why you were in that SUV. Nice ride for a federal agent. Maybe you've got a side hustle you're not telling us about. Miguel's patience was wearing thin, but he kept his voice measured. The SUV is government issued. I was on my way to a classified meeting. If you call the bureau, they'll confirm. Grayson held up a hand to silence him. Enough with the FBI story. Guys like you always think you're above the law. Let me guess. You're going to tell me you have some fancy degree, a spotless record, and a big shot job. Miguel leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with the officer. That's exactly what I'm telling you. And if you continue down this path, you're going to regret not listening. Grayson's smirk faltered for a split second before he recovered. Big talk for someone in cuffs. At that moment, another officer approached. He was younger, with a nervous energy that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with what was happening. He whispered something to Grayson, who frowned and waved him off. "Stay out of this, Andrews," Grayson muttered. Andrews hesitated, his eyes darting to Miguel. But what if he really is? I said, "Stay out of it," Grayson snapped, louder this time. Andrews stepped back, clearly conflicted. Miguel filed the interaction away in his mind. Andrews might be an ally, or at least someone who could be persuaded to do the right thing. As the minutes dragged on, Miguel's frustration grew. The station buzzed with activity, but no one seemed in any hurry to confirm his identity. He wondered how long they planned to keep him here, wasting time on a baseless accusation while real criminals roamed free. He thought of his meeting now missed, and the potential fallout from his absence. But more than that, he thought of the principle at stake. This wasn't just about him. It was about standing up against a system that too often got it wrong. Finally, Grayson returned, holding a clipboard. "We're going to process you," he said, almost casually. "Fingerprints, photos, the whole 9 yards. Then we'll see if your story checks out." Miguel's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Fine, let's do it. The sooner you realize your mistake, the better." As he was led to the processing area, Miguel noticed Andrews lingering nearby, his expression troubled. Miguel caught his eye briefly, offering a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a silent message. Asterisk, do the right thing, masterisk. The processing area was sterile and cold, with grey walls and a faint smell of disinfectant. Miguel stood still as his mugshot was taken, his face calm but defiant. When they took his fingerprints, he made a point of looking directly at the officer handling the scanner. He wanted them to remember this moment, not as a victory, but as a mistake they'd come to regret. Afterward, Miguel was led to a holding cell. The door clanged shut behind him, the sound echoing in the small, dimly lit space. He sat on the metal bench, his mind racing. He needed a way to expedite this, to get someone at the bureau to intervene. But without his phone or badge, his options were limited. He glanced at the other men in the cell. 2 rough-looking individuals who eyed him with curiosity. Miguel ignored them, focusing instead on the faint sounds of the station beyond the cell door. He could hear Grayson's voice, still mocking, still dismissive. And then, faintly, he heard Andrews again, his tone more insistent this time. "I really think we should double-check his ID," Andrews was saying. "What if we're wrong?" Miguel allowed himself a small glimmer of hope. Perhaps Andrews would be the key to unraveling this mess. But for now, all he could do was wait, and prepare for the moment when he could take back control. Miguel leaned back against the cold wall of the holding cell, the distant sounds of the precinct humming like a dissonant symphony around him. Every clanging door, every muffled voice, every hurried footstep. Each sound seemed to underline the absurdity of the situation. He, an FBI agent with years of service and an impeccable record, now sat confined like a criminal, while the real injustice played out just beyond the bars. Across the cell, the 2 men sitting on the opposite bench watched him curiously. One of them, a wiry man with tattoos crawling up his neck, finally broke the silence. "So, what's your deal?" he asked, his voice laced with skepticism. "You don't look like you belong here." Miguel offered a faint smile, but his response was measured. "Neither do you." The man chuckled, a low, dry sound. Touché. But seriously, you some kind of suit or something. You've got that vibe. Miguel didn't confirm or deny. Instead, he redirected. What about you? Why are you here? The man shrugged. Wrong place, wrong time. You know how it is. Miguel nodded. He didn't know too well. The man's answer, vague as it was, felt like an echo of his own predicament. It was a small reminder of how easily lives could be disrupted by assumptions, by biases, by systems that didn't always get it right. Meanwhile, outside the cell, Officer Andrews hovered near the processing desk, clearly torn. He kept glancing at Miguel's file, now lying open on the desk where Grayson had left it. The file contained only the bare minimum, Miguel's name, the bogus charge, and a few hastily scribbled notes. Andrews knew it wasn't enough to justify the arrest, but questioning Grayson was risky. Grayson was a senior officer, respected, or at least feared, by most of the precinct. Pushing back too hard could mean trouble for Andrews' career. But something about this case didn't sit right with him. Andrews had spent years trying to prove he wasn't like some of the others on the force, the ones who let their prejudices cloud their judgment. If he ignored his instincts now, he'd be no better than them. He glanced toward the holding cells, where Miguel sat silently. His demeanor wasn't that of a criminal or someone trying to hide something. If anything, he seemed more composed than most people Andrews had seen in custody, more confident, more controlled. It was unsettling in its own way, but it also made Andrews think. What if Miguel was telling the truth? Back in the bullpen, Grayson was holding court, recounting the arrest to a group of officers like it was a scene from an action movie. Guy thought he could flash some fake badge and walk away, he said, laughing, but I wasn't born yesterday. One of the younger officers chuckled nervously. You sure it's fake? Grayson shot him a glare. You questioning me? The younger officer shook his head quickly. No, sir. Just wondering. Well, stop wondering, Grayson snapped. I've seen plenty of guys like him before. Smooth talkers, always with a story. Trust me, he's guilty of something. Andrews overheard the exchange and felt a wave of frustration. Grayson's arrogance was infuriating, but it was also dangerous. His refusal to even entertain the possibility that he was wrong could have serious consequences, not just for Miguel, but for the entire precinct if the truth came out. Summoning his courage, Andrews approached the group. Grayson, he said, keeping his tone neutral, mind if I take another look at his ID? Just to double check. Grayson smirked. Still can't let it go, huh? Fine. Knock yourself out. But when you don't find anything, you owe me a coffee. Andrews nodded, hiding his irritation, and picked up Miguel's jacket from the evidence bin. He carefully retrieved the badge and credentials, examining them closely. The badge was authentic, he could tell just by the weight and the craftsmanship. And the ID card, with its embossed seal and official markings, left no doubt. Miguel Ramirez wasn't just an FBI agent, he was high-ranking. Andrews felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Grayson had made a huge mistake, and now the entire precinct was complicit. He glanced toward the holding cells again, then back at the bullpen, where Grayson was still laughing with the other officers. Andrews knew he had to act, but how? Meanwhile, Miguel sat in the cell, his mind still racing. He thought of his team at the bureau, who would undoubtedly be wondering where he was by now. He thought of the meeting he'd missed and the potential fallout from his absence. But more than anything, he thought of the principle at stake. If he let this slide, if he didn't push back, it would only embolden people like Grayson to keep doing what they were doing. He glanced at the two men in the cell with him. The wiry man was now leaning back, arms crossed, while the other, a stockier man with a shaved head, was watching Miguel with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. So, are you going to tell us what you're really in for? The stocky man asked. Because you don't strike me as a drug-dealing type. Miguel smirked faintly. I'm not. The man raised an eyebrow. Then why'd they bring you in? Because someone made a mistake, Miguel replied. And instead of admitting it, they're doubling down. The stocky man whistled softly. That's rough. You a lawyer or something? Something like that, Miguel said, deciding not to elaborate. The last thing he needed was for word to get out that there was an FBI agent in custody. That would only complicate things further. The wiry man chuckled. Well, good luck proving it. These guys don't like being wrong. Miguel didn't respond. He didn't need luck. He needed patience. He needed leverage. And he needed someone on the outside to step up. In the bullpen, Andrews was pacing, debating his next move. He could confront Grayson directly, but that would likely backfire. Grayson wasn't the type to admit he was wrong, especially not in front of his peers. Instead, Andrews decided to take a different approach. He picked up the phone at his desk and dialed a number he rarely used, Internal Affairs. As the phone rang, Andrews felt a pang of unease. Calling Aya was a risky move. It could paint him as a troublemaker, someone who didn't play by the unspoken rules of the precinct. But as the voice on the other end answered, Andrews made his decision. This is Officer Andrews, he said quietly. I need to report a potential misconduct incident involving a detainee. It's urgent. The precinct felt like a pressure cooker, the tension palpable in the air. Grayson, still basking in his self-assured arrogance, lounged near the coffee machine, cracking jokes with a few of his colleagues. But beneath the surface of his bravado, there was an edge, a flicker of unease that he didn't want to acknowledge. Deep down, he knew there was something different about this arrest, something that didn't fit. Andrews hung up the phone, his heart pounding. He had kept his conversation with Internal Affairs brief, just enough to alert them to the situation and give them Miguel's name. They assured him they would look into it, but their tone was cautious, as if wary of stepping into what might become a messy battle. Andrews didn't blame them. Calling IA was a nuclear option. It was a gamble, and now he could only wait to see how it would play out. Miguel, still sitting in the holding cell, noticed the shift in energy as Andrews walked past. The younger officer's shoulders were tense, his movements purposeful. Miguel's instincts told him that Andrews had done something significant, something that might tip the scales. But he also knew that any help would come at a cost. People like Grayson didn't take challenges to their authority lightly. Across the precinct, the phone at the front desk rang, cutting through the low hum of activity. The desk sergeant answered it with a bored expression. But that quickly changed as the conversation continued. His eyes widened, and he straightened in his chair, casting a glance toward the bullpen. Grayson noticed and raised an eyebrow. What's going on, Sarge? He called out. The desk sergeant hesitated, then hung up the phone. Grayson, you might want to come here. Grayson strode over, his swagger intact, though there was a slight stiffness to his gait. What is it? The sergeant leaned in, lowering his voice, but Miguel, watching from across the room, could tell something big had just happened. He couldn't hear the words, but he saw the way Grayson's jaw tightened, the way his confident smirk faltered ever so slightly. No way, Grayson muttered, his voice carrying just enough for Miguel to catch. This has to be a mistake. Miguel allowed himself a faint smile. The walls were closing in on Grayson, and he knew it. But the question remained. How far would Grayson go to protect himself? People like him didn't give up easily. They doubled down, just like he had during the arrest. And that made him dangerous. As Grayson stalked back toward the bullpen, Andrews intercepted him. Grayson, he began, keeping his voice calm but firm, we need to let Ramirez go. His badge checks out. He's not just an FBI agent, he's senior level. If we keep him here any longer, it's going to blow up in our faces. Grayson stopped, turning to face Andrews with a look of pure disdain. And who the hell do you think you are, telling me how to do my job? Andrews didn't flinch. I'm just trying to stop this from turning into a bigger problem than it already is. Aya's going to find out about this. If they haven't already, they will soon. Grayson's eyes narrowed. You called Aya? Andrews held his ground. I did what I thought was right. Grayson's face darkened, his hands balling into fists. For a moment, Miguel thought he might actually take a swing at Andrews. But then Grayson stepped back. his lips curling into a bitter smile. You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? Fine. Let's see how that works out for you. He turned abruptly and headed for the holding cells. Miguel tensed as he approached, his every muscle coiled like a spring. Grayson unlocked the cell door and stepped inside, standing over Miguel with a smug expression. Well, Agent Ramirez, he said, his tone dripping with mockery. It seems like you've got some friends in high places, but don't think for a second that this is over. People like you always slip up eventually. Miguel stood, meeting Grayson's gaze head-on. People like me, he repeated, his voice calm but loaded with meaning. You mean people who know the law? Who work to uphold it instead of abusing it? Grayson's smirk faded, replaced by a flash of anger. Watch yourself, he warned. Miguel didn't back down. You're going to have to answer for this. Not to me, but to your superiors. And when that happens, I hope you remember this moment. Grayson stepped back, his jaw clenched, and gestured for Miguel to follow him. Let's get this over with. Miguel was led back to the front desk, where his belongings had been placed in a plastic tray. As he retrieved his badge, his phone, and a small notebook he always carried, he felt a surge of relief tempered by the knowledge that this wasn't the end. Grayson might let him walk out of the precinct, but the real fight was just beginning. As Miguel stepped outside, the cool night air hit him like a splash of water, washing away some of the tension, but leaving behind a smoldering determination. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number, waiting as it rang. When the familiar voice on the other end answered, he spoke with quiet urgency. It's me, he said. We've got a problem. I'll explain everything when I get there, but I need this escalated. Now. The voice on the other end didn't hesitate. Understood. We'll take care of it. Miguel ended the call and stood for a moment, letting the weight of the night settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just about what had happened to him. It was about what could happen to anyone in his position, about the systems and people that allowed it to continue. And he wasn't going to let it slide. Back inside the precinct, Andrews sat at his desk, watching as Grayson's slender file drawer shot with enough force to rattle the pens in their holder. The room was quieter now, the other officers wary of getting caught in the fallout. Andrews knew he had made an enemy in Grayson, but he didn't regret it. Someone had to stand up, even if it came at a cost. But as the tension in the precinct simmered, something else was brewing. Something that neither Grayson nor Miguel, nor even Andrews fully understood yet. The phone call Miguel had made wasn't just a plea for help. It was the first step in a chain of events that would shake the precinct to its core. And as Miguel walked away from the building, his resolve unshaken, he knew one thing for certain. The fight was far from over. Miguel's footsteps echoed on the quiet street as he left the precinct behind, his thoughts racing. The cool night air was a stark contrast to the simmering tension inside him. He replayed the events of the night in his mind, analyzing every detail, every interaction. Grayson wasn't just incompetent, he was dangerous. The arrogance, the blind prejudice, the unwillingness to admit a mistake. It was a toxic mix that could ruin lives. Miguel knew this was bigger than his own ordeal. It was systemic, and it demanded action. As he reached his car, he noticed something odd. A dark sedan was parked a little too close, its engine running, the faint glow of a cigarette visible through the driver's side window. Miguel's instincts, honed by years in the FBI, kicked in. He slowed his pace, pretending to check his phone while discreetly scanning the surroundings. The street was mostly empty, but the sedan stood out like a beacon. He opened his car door casually, keeping his movements relaxed, but his mind was on high alert. Sliding into the driver's seat, he locked the doors and adjusted the rear-view mirror, keeping an eye on the sedan. It didn't move, for now. Miguel started his engine and pulled onto the road, taking a deliberate route through the city. At every turn, the sedan stayed behind him, its headlights a constant presence in his mirror. Whoever they weren't trying to be subtle. Miguel felt his grip on the steering wheel tighten. He was used to being followed. Occupational hazard. But this felt different. It felt personal. Deciding to test his theory, Miguel made a sharp turn onto a side street, then another, weaving through a series of alleys and back roads. The sedan kept up, its persistence confirming his suspicions. They weren't just following him. They wanted him to know he was being followed. Miguel's mind raced as he considered his options. He could confront them, but that carried risks. If they were armed or had backup, it could escalate quickly. Alternatively, he could try to lose them, but that wasn't a guarantee. Instead, he chose a third option. He called for help. He pressed a button on his dashboard, activating the secure communication line installed in his car. "This is Ramirez," he said, keeping his voice steady. "I'm being followed. Black sedan, no plates. Need a trace on my location and backup en route." The response was immediate. "Roger that, Ramirez. Hold tight. We're tracking your location now." Reassured, Miguel focused on maintaining control of the situation. He continued driving, leading the sedan away from populated areas and toward a quieter industrial zone. If things came to a head, he wanted to minimize collateral damage. As he pulled into an empty parking lot, the sedan finally made its move. It accelerated, cutting him off and forcing him to stop. Two men stepped out, both dressed in dark clothing, their faces partially obscured by caps. One of them held a flashlight, but it was clear from the bulge under his jacket that he was armed. The other man approached Miguel's car with deliberate slowness, tapping on the driver's side window. Miguel rolled it down a fraction, just enough to speak. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. The man leaned closer, his expression unreadable. "You're Miguel Ramirez, right?" Miguel didn't answer. Instead, he reached for his badge, holding it up for the man to see. "Special Agent Ramirez, FBI. You want to explain why you're following me?" The man smirked. "You're asking the wrong questions, Agent. The real question is, who's protecting you?" Before Miguel could respond, the man pulled out a small device and placed it on the car's hood. It blinked once, then twice, before emitting a sharp beep. Miguel's heart sank as he realized what it was: a signal jammer. His secure line was now useless. "Step out of the car," the man ordered, his voice cold. Miguel hesitated, calculating his next move. He could comply and risk being overpowered, or he could resist and risk escalation. But before he could decide, the distant wail of sirens cut through the night, growing louder with each passing second. The man cursed under his breath, grabbing the device from the hood and signaling to his partner. "Another time, Agent," he said, retreating to the sedan. Within moments, they were gone, disappearing into the night as quickly as they had appeared. Miguel exhaled, his hands still gripping the steering wheel. The sirens drew closer until a convoy of black SUVs pulled into the lot, their lights flashing. Out stepped a team of agents, led by a woman Miguel recognized instantly, his superior, Special Agent Natalie Reyes. "Are you okay?" Reyes asked, striding over to him. Miguel nodded, stepping out of the car. "They knew who I was," he said, his voice low. "And they had a jammer. This wasn't random." Reyes frowned, her expression grim. "We've got teams sweeping the area, but if they knew your identity, this goes deeper than we thought." Miguel met her gaze, the weight of the night settling heavily on him. "This isn't just about me, Natalie. It's about what I saw in that precinct. Grayson, the arrest, all of it. Someone's trying to send a message." Reyes nodded, her jaw tightening. "And now we need to find out who. And why." The stakes had just risen, and Miguel knew there was no turning back. What had started as a wrongful arrest had spiraled into something much bigger, something that threatened not just his career, but his very life. As the agents secured the area and began their investigation, Miguel stood in the middle of the lot, his mind racing with questions. The answers were out there, but finding them would come at a cost, and he was prepared to pay it. As the night wore on, Miguel sat in the dimly lit briefing room at the FBI field office, going over the details of the night with Reyes and a small team of trusted agents. Every piece of the puzzle was laid out in front of them: Grayson's behavior, the unwarranted arrest, the suspicious men who had followed Miguel, and the signal jammer. But even with all the evidence, the full picture remained elusive. Reyes paced the room, her arms crossed, her mind clearly working through the possibilities. The men who tailed you weren't amateurs, she said. They knew enough to intercept your secure line, and they knew your identity. This isn't just about a bad cop making bad decisions. There's more at play here. Miguel leaned forward, his elbows on the table. Grayson is hiding something. He knew exactly what he was doing when he arrested me. This wasn't a random mistake. It was intentional. Someone told him to target me. Reyes stopped pacing, her eyes narrowing. You think Grayson is working with them? Whoever they are? Miguel nodded. It adds up. The timing, the overconfidence, the way he brushed off Andrews when he tried to intervene. It's all too calculated. Grayson is part of something bigger, and they're trying to protect whatever it is. Before Reyes could respond, an agent burst into the room, a laptop in hand. We got something, he said, placing the laptop on the table and turning it toward Reyes and Miguel. We pulled surveillance footage from the precinct's parking lot. Look at this. The video showed Grayson stepping outside after Miguel had been detained. He was on his phone, pacing nervously, his expression far less smug than it had been inside the precinct. Moments later, a black SUV pulled up, and a man in a suit got out. The two exchanged a few terse words before the man handed Grayson a thick envelope. Grayson took it, glancing around nervously, before tucking it under his jacket and heading back inside. Miguel's jaw tightened as he watched the footage. That's our link, he said. Who's the guy in the suit? The agent tapped a few keys on the laptop, bringing up a freeze frame of the man's face. Facial recognition flagged him. His name's Victor Hale, known associate of a private security firm that's been under investigation for corruption and illegal activities. They've been implicated in everything from falsified reports to intimidation tactics. Reyes' expression darkened. And now they're using local cops to do their dirty work. Grayson must have been on their payroll. Miguel stood, the pieces falling into place. They weren't just targeting me because I'm FBI. They were trying to send a message. To me, to anyone who gets too close to whatever they're involved in. Reyes nodded, and we just intercepted that message. As the team began planning their next move, an alert popped up on the screen. A notification from the precinct's internal systems. Grayson had accessed Miguel's file moments ago. He was looking for something, or worse, trying to cover his tracks. Reyes didn't hesitate. We're going to the precinct. Now. The convoy of SUVs sped through the city, their lights flashing as they raced toward the precinct. Miguel felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was it, the final confrontation. If they didn't act now, Grayson and his allies could destroy the evidence and disappear. When they arrived, the precinct was eerily quiet. Reyes led the team inside, her badge held high as she announced their presence. FBI. Everyone stay where you are. Grayson was at his desk, his face pale as he saw the agents pouring into the room. He stood abruptly, but Reyes was faster. Grayson, she called out, her voice sharp. Step away from the computer. For a moment, Grayson hesitated, his hand hovering over the keyboard. Then, with a sudden burst of desperation, he lunged for a drawer, pulling out a flash drive. But Miguel was on him in an instant, grabbing his wrist and forcing him to drop it. Game over, Miguel said, his voice steady. Grayson glared at him, his bravado crumbling. You have no idea what you're messing with, he spat. This goes higher than me, higher than you. Reyes stepped forward, picking up the flash drive. And we'll find out exactly how high. As the agents secured the scene and began combing through the evidence, Miguel couldn't shake the feeling that Grayson's words were more than just bluster. There was something in his tone, a certainty that suggested the battle wasn't over. Later, back at the field office, the team decrypted the flash drive. It contained a trove of documents, emails, financial transactions, and detailed plans for operations tied to Victor Hale's security firm. But one file stood out. A list of names. Names of individuals within law enforcement, government agencies, and even the judiciary, all suspected of being compromised. As they stared at the list, Reyes let out a low whistle. This isn't just a local problem. This is national. Miguel nodded, his expression grim. And it's just the beginning. But then, as Reyes began to call in reinforcements, Miguel's phone buzzed with a text. It was an unknown number, and the message was chilling in its simplicity. Asterisk, you've made a mistake. Walk away while you still can. Asterisk. Miguel stared at the screen, his heart pounding. The fight wasn't over, it was only just beginning.